There's something almost sacred about the way Nicholas begins his mornings. Every day, without fail, he wakes up at 6. Not because an alarm clock insists on it, but because his body has learned to greet the quiet. He swings his legs over the side of the bed, feels the old floorboards cool beneath his feet, and walks to the same wooden window he's opened every morning for 8 years. It's not much to look at, a simple frame that creaks if you don't lift it just right, but for him, it's a doorway to a life he chose. Outside, the pine trees stand like patient sentinels. Some days there's frost on the grass, other days, a soft morning mist, but always, the same hush that seems to say, "You're exactly where you're meant to be." Nicholas is 70 now. He lives alone in a small cabin tucked at the edge of the woods, about 20 minutes from town. To some, that sounds lonely, maybe even a little sad. His neighbors certainly thought so. A few of them tried to help in their own well-meaning way. One woman said he should adopt a dog, so he'd have someone to keep him company. Another invited him to the local community center's dance nights, promising he'd meet nice people. Nicholas would always smile politely, thank them for their kindness. But deep down, he never felt the need to explain why he wasn't searching for more company. He had already found something most people spend their whole lives chasing, a sense of being complete, exactly as he was. See, it hadn't always been this way. For decades, Nicholas wore all the roles that were expected of him. He was a husband, a steady, dependable partner. He was a father, present, if sometimes a little too quiet. He was a provider, 35 years of showing up to the same warehouse job, making sure there was always gas in the car and food in the fridge. From the outside, you might have thought he had everything figured out. A tidy lawn, a house full of family photos, to kids who grew up strong and kind. But if you had asked Nicholas back then if he was truly happy, he wouldn't have known how to answer. Because somewhere along the way, he had started to disappear into all those expectations. Whenever something felt off, an argument left unfinished, a moment of sadness he couldn't name, he did what his own father had taught him. He kept busy. He fixed the broken hinge, mowed the grass, organized the garage. His hands were always moving, so his heart didn't have to. Maybe you know what that's like, living in a house full of people, but still feeling alone. Maybe you've stood in your own kitchen, listening to someone else's voice, and wondered when yours stopped mattering. For Nicholas, it wasn't cruelty or betrayal that ended his marriage. It was neglect, the quiet kind that piles up in the corners of a life until one day you realize you're living beside a stranger and you are that stranger, too. When the divorce came, it wasn't loud. No slammed doors, no courtroom battles. Just two people who finally admitted that what they'd built together had turned into something neither of them recognized. He stayed in their old house for a while after she moved out. It should have been comforting, familiar walls, the same old furniture, but every corner felt haunted by who he used to be. The dependable man, the predictable man. The man who never said too much. It took him months to gather the courage to leave. He packed his books, the record player he'd almost forgotten he loved, a few worn-out shirts that still smelled like home. And he drove out past the edge of town, out where the road turned to gravel and the air smelled of pine and rain. That cabin wasn't just an escape. It was a declaration. I am still here. I still belong to myself. So when people say it must be sad, this quiet life he's built, Nicholas only smiles. Because he knows what it's like to feel unseen in a house full of voices. And he knows what it feels like now to open a window to the cold morning air, pour his coffee, and finally hear his own thoughts again. Maybe that's not loneliness. Maybe that's freedom. And maybe, for some of us, it's exactly what we've needed all along. At first, the silence felt almost like a blessing. After decades of a house humming with other people's voices, Nicholas welcomed the quiet the way you welcome a long exhale. He could finally hear himself think. No television murmuring in the background. No dishwasher clanking through dinner. No footsteps creaking overhead. But it didn't take long for that same silence to shift into something else, something emptier. In those early months, he kept setting the table for two out of sheer habit. He'd catch himself placing a second fork beside his plate, only to pick it up again with a small, embarrassed smile. His dinners were simple: scrambled eggs, a bowl of soup, a sandwich if he felt ambitious. He ate slowly, not because he was savoring every bite, but because there was nowhere else to be afterward. No conversations waiting, no one to ask, "How was your day?" Sometimes he left the radio on while he ate. Some evenings, it was jazz. Other nights, just the news droning in the background. But no matter what he tuned into, the air still felt hollow, like the house itself was reminding him, "You're alone now." That's when he discovered that loneliness isn't always loud. It doesn't always show up in big waves of sadness or heartbreak. Sometimes it's just the quiet realization that no one notices whether you've eaten breakfast, or if you leave the light on all night. No one knows if you fell asleep in your chair, or if you spent the whole afternoon listening to the wind in the pines. Have you ever felt that way, like your life was unfolding in a place no one could see? For a while, Nicholas wondered if maybe he was missing something essential. Maybe what he needed wasn't just solitude, but connection, someone to share the hours with. So he tried dating again. He met a woman for coffee. She was kind and polite. They talked about books, about places they had traveled, about the small routines that made up their days. From the outside, it probably looked like a perfectly ordinary date. But sitting across from her, Nicholas felt like he was reading from a script he didn't remember agreeing to perform. He nodded and smiled at the right moments, asked polite questions, but the entire time, he felt like he was holding his breath. When he got home that evening, he sat down in his favorite chair, took a deep breath, and felt something unexpected, a wave of relief. Not because he disliked her, but because he realized he didn't want to spend the rest of his life performing. He missed connection, yes, but he didn't miss the expectation to be someone he no longer was. So he made a choice, not to be alone by default, but to remain alone by intention. And in that decision, he started to understand something important. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to sit quietly with yourself and trust that your own company is enough. Sometimes, transformation doesn't happen in a single, life-altering moment. For Nicholas, it unfolded in dozens of small, almost unremarkable choices that slowly began to reshape his days. There was no dramatic revelation, no morning when he jumped out of bed proclaiming that he was a new man. Instead, it started quietly, almost by accident. One afternoon, he looked around his living room and realized the furniture was still arranged for a life he no longer lived. The couch faced the television, like it always had, even though he'd barely turned it on anymore. So he decided to move it. It sounds simple, doesn't it? Just a couch. But for Nicholas, angling it toward the big front window instead of the TV was an act of reclaiming space. Every afternoon after that, golden light would pour through the glass, landing on the old cushions. He'd sit there with his coffee and watch the shadows shift across the floor, feeling like, finally, this room belonged to him. Next came the garden. The patchy grass behind his cabin had never been much to look at, but Nicholas thought maybe it deserved more care. He dug up a small rectangle of earth and planted tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. At first, it was just something to fill the hours. But as days turned into weeks, he found comfort in the quiet rhythm, watering, pulling weeds, checking for new blossoms. Have you ever noticed how working with your hands can calm your mind in ways you can't explain? That's what the garden became for Nicholas, a place where he didn't have to be anything but present. As the seasons changed, so did his habits. He began cooking real meals again, roasted vegetables, simple fish dishes with fresh herbs he'd picked himself. He even lit a candle at the dinner table, just to see how it felt. When he blew it out each night, the house didn't feel quite so hollow anymore. On the bookshelves, he rediscovered novels he'd once set aside because they were too slow. Now, their gentle pace felt like an invitation to savor each page. He'd underlined sentences that made him pause. Sometimes, he scribbled notes in the margins, not for anyone else to read, just for himself. Every little act, moving a chair, planting a seed, cooking something nourishing, was a quiet declaration. I'm still here. I still matter. You know, it's easy to think we need something grand to reclaim our lives, a big move, a new relationship, a reinvention. But sometimes, all it takes is the courage to ask, what would make this space feel like mine again? If you've ever felt buried under expectations, I hope Nicholas's story reminds you that you can begin again in small ways. You don't have to wait for permission. You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. If this reflection spoke to you, I'd love to have you here as part of this community. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss more stories about finding meaning, even in the quietest corners of life. When Nicholas first moved into his cabin, the phone rang almost every week. His daughter would call on Sunday afternoons, her voice warm and just a little bit worried. His son sent photos of the grandkids' little league games, messy birthday parties, Christmas cards where everyone was lined up in matching sweaters, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. For a while, those calls and messages felt like a lifeline. They were proof that he still mattered to someone, even if he was no longer part of their everyday chaos. But time has a way of shifting things, doesn't it? Little by little, the calls grew farther apart. Sunday phone calls turned into occasional texts. Eventually, even the neighbors who used to wave from across the fence moved away or simply stopped reaching out as often. Nicholas could have let that feel like abandonment. And maybe, at moments, it did. He'd catch himself picking up the phone to call someone, only to put it back down because he wasn't sure what he'd say. He knew they loved him. He also knew they were busy building lives of their own and he didn't want to be another item on a long list of obligations. So he found his own way to stay connected, one that didn't require anyone to always pick up the phone or write back quickly. Each week, he sat down with a pen and a stack of old stationery. He wrote letters to his daughter describing the little squirrel who visited the garden each morning. To his son, he shared how he'd finally fixed that old record player and was listening to albums he hadn't touched in 30 years. Sometimes, he filled pages with thoughts and memories he never mailed at all, words that weren't meant to be answered, just released. Maybe you felt something similar, the ache of watching old connections fade, even when there's no anger or falling out. It can be hard to accept that love sometimes grows quieter, not because it's gone, but because life keeps moving. Nicholas learned something important in those quiet stretches. Connection doesn't always mean constant contact. Sometimes, it's simply holding someone in your thoughts while giving them space to live their own story. He came to understand that letting go wasn't the same as disappearing. It was a way to love without demanding anything in return. He still hoped the phone might ring now and then, and sometimes, it did. When it didn't, he didn't feel forgotten. He felt peaceful, rooted in a life he chose on purpose. If you've ever felt the loneliness that comes with change, I hope this reminds you, you can stay connected in ways that don't always look like what you expected. If this story speaks to you, I'd love for you to be part of this community. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more reflections on finding meaning and belonging, even as life shifts around us. Some people looked at Nicholas's quiet life and assumed he must be bitter. They imagined a man who sat alone because he couldn't do better, or because he carried some heavy regret he never talked about. You might have heard these same assumptions yourself, that if someone spends their days alone, it must mean they've somehow failed. But Nicholas didn't see it that way at all. In fact, the older he got, the clearer he became about what actually matters and what doesn't. He had learned, sometimes the hard way, that being in a relationship isn't the ultimate measure of a life well lived. He remembered the years he spent in a marriage that looked steady on the outside, but felt hollow on the inside. The dinners where every word was chosen carefully, not out of kindness, but out of fear of saying the wrong thing. The nights when he went to bed feeling like a stranger in his own home. He'd come to see that just because two people share a roof doesn't mean they share a connection. And sometimes, the loneliness that grows in the space between two people is even harder to carry than the solitude that comes when you're alone. Nicholas wasn't angry about those years. He didn't look back and wish he could erase them. He knew he'd loved as best he could with what he understood back then. But he also knew he wouldn't trade his current peace for the illusion of companionship again. People often say that any relationship is better than none. But have you ever really stopped to question that idea? Is it truly better to fill the empty chairs around your table with company that drains you, just so you won't have to face the quiet? Nicholas decided he would rather sit alone in the morning light, coffee in hand, feeling fully himself, than perform in another partnership that asked him to shrink or to pretend. He no longer measured his days by who called or who stayed. He measured them by whether he was showing up honestly for himself. That kind of clarity doesn't always get applause. It makes some people uncomfortable to see someone content in their own company. But Nicholas had reached a place where he didn't need anyone else's understanding to feel at peace. Maybe you know someone like that, a person who chose authenticity over expectations. Or maybe you felt the pull yourself, the quiet realization that being alone isn't the same as being abandoned, and that solitude can be a choice rooted in deep self-respect. If this story resonates with you, I'd love for you to be part of this space. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories about finding clarity and peace in unexpected places. And if you've ever chosen to honor your own truth over fitting in, know that you're not alone in that either. You know, whenever someone asked Nicholas if he was afraid of dying alone, he would just smile softly and change the subject. People assumed that must be his greatest fear, that final moment with no one sitting beside him, no hand to hold. But the truth was something most people never guessed. Nicholas wasn't afraid of dying alone. What truly scared him was living the rest of his days as someone he no longer recognized. For decades, he had worn the same familiar mask, the dependable man, the strong one, the problem solver who never let his feelings spill out. He knew how to keep the peace, how to fix what was broken except for his own heart. Maybe you've seen this too, someone who spends years performing a role they didn't even realize they'd been cast in. They become the person everyone leans on, the one who never complains. They say I'm fine so often that it stops meaning anything. That was Nicholas. He could remember countless evenings when he'd sit in his favorite chair after work, the TV flickering silently in front of him, wondering if anyone truly knew him, or if he'd ever really allowed himself to be known. He wasn't interested in returning to that version of himself, the man who gave up his quiet truths just to make everyone else comfortable. That was the real fear, not solitude, but losing the hard-won peace he'd finally built. Some people think solitude is something you tolerate until something better comes along, but Nicholas saw it differently. To him, solitude was honest, it was predictable. He didn't have to tiptoe around another person's moods or feel like he was performing for an invisible audience. He could rise when he pleased, make coffee exactly the way he liked it, and spend an afternoon in the garden without needing to explain himself to anyone. He wasn't waiting for someone to rescue him from his own company. He wasn't lonely in the way people assumed. He was simply determined never again to trade his calm for the exhausting scramble to please. If anything frightened Nicholas, it was the thought that he might slip back into those old patterns, agreeing to things he didn't believe in, smiling to smooth things over, pretending that just okay was enough. He'd spent too many years saying yes when he meant no, staying silent when his heart was aching to speak. He'd learned, sometimes painfully, that there are worse things than being alone. One of them is forgetting who you are, little by little, just to be loved by someone who doesn't really see you. So when people asked if he was afraid of the quiet, he wished he could tell them the whole story, that solitude wasn't his enemy. It was the space where he finally found himself and the person he discovered there was worth protecting. If you believe that honoring who you are is more important than performing for others, consider subscribing to this channel. Together, we can share more stories about choosing self-respect over old expectations and finding peace exactly where you are. Sometimes, joy doesn't burst through the door with fanfare. Sometimes, it slips in so quietly you almost don't notice. That's exactly how it happened for Nicholas. It began with a squirrel. Every morning, just after sunrise, the same little creature would scamper across the edge of his porch, its tiny paws tiptoeing near the tomato plants before disappearing behind the woodpile. One day, Nicholas decided to leave out a handful of sunflower seeds, just to see if the squirrel might come closer. And it did. That small, simple exchange became part of his daily rhythm, a soft reminder that connection didn't have to be complicated or loud. It could be as gentle as two living beings sharing the same quiet space. Before long, Nicholas noticed other small pleasures blooming in his days. He started carrying his coffee mug outside instead of drinking it at the kitchen table. The morning air felt crisper. The coffee tasted richer when he sipped it beneath the open sky. He began fixing things around the house not because he had to, but because it felt good to care for the space that now truly belonged to him. There was something almost sacred in these ordinary moments. Folding laundry while an old jazz record played in the background. Pulling weeds in the garden, feeling the sun warm the back of his neck. Lighting a candle at dinner and letting it burn long after the meal was over. Nicholas realized that happiness wasn't a grand destination waiting far ahead. It was already here, tucked into the corners of his daily life. He found himself smiling, not because of some big event or exciting plan, but simply because the day felt good as it was. Have you ever noticed how the smallest rituals can anchor you in the present? How they can remind you that you don't need an audience to feel content. Maybe it's the way the light hits your kitchen counter in the late afternoon, or the first sip of tea when the house is still quiet. For Nicholas, these tiny moments were proof that he had built a life of his own making. one not defined by who he used to be or who people thought he should become. He was no longer measuring the worth of his days by whether someone called or knocked on his door. He was measuring it by how often he felt at peace, how often he felt real. And in that simplicity, he discovered a surprising truth. Happiness doesn't always arrive with applause or certainty. Sometimes, it shows up humbly, without asking for permission, and simply stays. If you've ever felt the quiet joy of belonging fully to yourself, or if you're still searching for it, know that you're not alone. And if this story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here, we share reflections and true stories about finding meaning in the everyday, and the courage it takes to create a life that feels honest and whole. If love ever returned to Nicholas's door, he knew one thing for certain: it would have to knock softly. No fanfare, no urgency, no promises of forever wrapped in a rush of excitement. You see, after all these years, Nicholas had learned that the most meaningful companionship isn't built on dramatic declarations. It's built on something quieter, like presence, patience, and the willingness to share the same space without needing to fill every silence. He often imagined what it might look like if someone came into his life again. Maybe she'd enjoy the hush of morning as much as he did. Maybe she'd understand that sharing a cup of coffee on the porch didn't require words, only a kind of gentle togetherness that asked nothing in return. If love came back, it wouldn't be about completing each other or performing for approval. He wouldn't trade his hard-won peace just to avoid being alone. And he certainly wouldn't bend himself into someone else's idea of who he should be. Have you ever wondered about this yourself? Whether you'd be willing to open your heart again, but only if it meant you could remain fully, unapologetically yourself. Nicholas knew that kind of love existed, but he also knew it was rare, and it never arrived when you demanded it. It came when it was ready, or sometimes it didn't come at all, and that was okay. His life had taught him something he wished he'd understood much sooner. Your worth doesn't depend on whether someone else chooses you. You don't become whole just because another person shows up to witness it. You become whole the moment you decide your life is already enough. So if love ever returned, if someone with a quiet spirit and a steady heart found her way to his porch, he'd welcome her with the same calm he brought to every morning. But if that day never came, he would still wake up grateful. He'd still open the window to let in the sunrise. He'd still drink his coffee exactly the way he liked it. Because his happiness no longer hung on the idea of being partnered. It lived in the way he felt at peace in his own skin. In the small rituals that made each day feel like it mattered. In the knowledge that he had become a man who belonged to himself, first and foremost. And maybe that's the greatest love story of all, the one where you finally learn to love your own company so much that any other connection can only be a gentle addition, never a necessity. If you found something in this story that speaks to your own experience, or if you're curious about how to build a life that feels truly yours, consider subscribing to the channel. We share stories like this to remind you that your worth is not measured by the presence or absence of someone else. It's measured by how deeply you've come to honor who you already are. Sometimes, the most profound turning point in a person's life isn't marked by a grand gesture or a milestone event. For Nicholas, it happened quietly, on an ordinary morning. He stood in front of his hallway mirror, toothbrush in hand, and looked himself straight in the eye. The reflection staring back wasn't a stranger anymore. It was simply him, without regret, without apology. There was a time when that same mirror showed a man constantly measuring his worth by the roles he played. The dependable husband who never forgot anniversaries, the father who always kept the lights on, the colleague who never missed a deadline. He had spent decades wrapped in labels that felt safe but never truly complete. And if you asked him back then who he was beneath all those identities, he might have struggled to answer. But standing there that morning, Nicholas felt something he hadn't known in years: a gentle acceptance. He didn't wish to look younger or stronger. He didn't wish for someone else to be standing beside him to validate that he mattered. He had finally discovered the strange and liberating truth that grief and joy can live in the same heart. That you can miss the laughter in the kitchen, even as you savor the quiet of your own company. That you can honor the memories without needing to crawl back into them. This wasn't a resignation, it was a reclamation. He no longer felt the urge to prove anything to the world. Not his resilience, not his relevance, not his ability to start over. He had lived enough years carrying other people's expectations, and it felt like a relief to finally set them down. There was no more pressure to be someone else's definition of a good man. Now, he simply got to be Nicholas. No more, no less. Some evenings were still tender with longing like holidays when the quiet stretched a little too far, or nights when he'd catch himself thinking about what could have been. But even then, he didn't feel undone. He knew those moments were part of the deal. Grief was the echo of something that once mattered. And joy was the proof he could still love his life, even without the old stories repeating themselves. If you were to ask Nicholas whether he was okay living alone, you wouldn't see a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He'd smile, maybe a little surprised you'd even wondered. And he'd tell you the truth he had waited most of his life to understand. I'm not alone. I'm with someone I've finally come to know, and I like him. It's a lesson so many of us spend decades avoiding, thinking happiness is always somewhere out there, tied to someone else's approval or affection. But maybe, just maybe, it lives closer to home in the mirror, in the small rituals of your day, in the way you talk to yourself when no one is listening. And if you felt even a flicker of recognition in this story, I invite you to stay connected here. Subscribe to this channel for more reflections and stories that honor the quiet, beautiful work of becoming whole. Because the truth is, belonging to yourself might be the most profound belonging of all.